Well, another spoiler season is upon us. LSS just came out with this Take the Bait card. Uh, I looked online and saw some reactions to it and was sad. That was my reaction to how people were talking about it on, Reddit. It just made me realize people don't really understand the game at all. In my opinion, evaluating value in cards in this game is very easy. In other games, if I have like a 2/2 in Magic the Gathering, like the value of a 2/2 is pretty situational, right? But in Flesh and Blood, like I can count like how much damage and how much block a card does and see if it's good or not. So the first thing I want to do, and what I'm going to be doing in this video, is I'm going to be determining the value of different cards. And so I want to do it for Take the Bait first. So Take the Bait is a Riptide specialization. Red, so it pitches for 1. It costs 0. It blocks 3. It says, search your deck for a card, shuffle, and put it on top. Create a bait token under an opponent's control. The bait says, you can't play or activate cards you own. So if your opponent has a bait, they have to use the bait. Action, destroy this when the chain link resolves, attack. So you can attack with it, and then attack reaction, this gets +1 and go again. Let's ignore this search your deck for a card part, right? Let's just look at this create a bait token under an opponent's control. What value does this actually give you? Okay, create a bait token under an opponent's control. Well, your opponent gets to attack you for 1 for free. Great. Okay, so we've played a red 0-cost non-attack 3-block in our deck. We could have blocked 3 with it. Instead, we decided not to. We have played the card and let our opponent attack us for 1. That's pretty clearly downside. And then we search our deck for a card, then shuffle and put it on top. Okay, maybe that part's good, right? So the obvious interaction here is that this bait triggers all of Riptide's traps, right, if they use the attack reaction. So once per turn attack reaction, this gets +1 and go again, right? So that triggers all the reacts you could possibly want. So the obvious thing, right, at first is to get a good trap. Riptide has a couple good traps. Okay, this is all of the traps you can possibly have, right? There's a couple interesting ones, right? You got Collapsing Trap. If your opponent attacks and activates the reaction on Take the Bait, then you can make them discard a card in their next hand. Cool. It also deals damage due to Riptide's ability, right? You could get Chain Reaction, right? Chain Reaction says when this defends an attack with Gogan, you may turn a non-attack action card in your arsenal face up. If you do, you may play it this turn as though it were an instant. So we can do things like, block with Chain Reaction, then play 3 of a kind from our arsenal, maybe. Who knows? The other one is Spike Pit Trap. When this defends and the attacking hero has played or activated a reaction to this chain link, put the top card of their deck into their graveyard, then they lose X life, where X is the number of cards in their graveyard with that name. Okay, so this maybe it deals like 8 if they activate the reaction. So your opponent doesn't get to know the trap, so you get a little information there. But let's just count out the total value of this card if you do the normal thing, right, which is you get a trap on the top of your deck and then play it targeting, them attacking with the bait. So you could have blocked with this for 3. Instead, you played it and gave your opponent a 1-damage weapon for free, right? So you could have blocked for 3, so you lost 3 value by playing the card, and your opponent attacked you for 1. So you've lost 4 value for taking the card, right? Then on the next turn, you block with Collapsing Trap, right? So you could have just blocked with any random card, right? And you could have not blocked a 0 for 1 that you gave them for free. You could have blocked like a real card that they had in their hand, right? Because the Take the Bait is not in their hand. It's not a card. They're not using a card. So you're blocking nothing, right? So you've used 2 cards to block nothing. You get the Riptide trigger to deal a damage. You get the Riptide trigger to put something in your arsenal. And then you get the trap trigger. Your opponent discards a card, basically, right? So I spent 2 cards to make my opponent discard 1. Is that something you want to do? Probably not, right? Now, let's say you get something that isn't a trap. Okay, you're playing a red 0/3 block, tutor to the top of your deck, right? So, and you give your opponent a 0/1 weapon. By the way, you give your opponent 1 damage. You could have blocked 3 and just drawn the cards you would have drawn that turn. Instead, you really want a specific card, right? We can talk about specific cards later. So, you lost 3 life, and then you lost 1 life. So the card you're getting better be more than 7 value, because your average card has 3 value, and you lost 4 trying to put it on top of your deck, right? So it better be more than 7 value, because you lost 4 value in order to put it on top of your deck. Not to mention, this card is a red 3 block, right? It's not a blue. If this card were a blue, you know, you could say like, yeah, it's like not a great card, but it's a blue. So we can block with it or pitch with it. And then like, if we're left with 5 cards and we don't really know what to do, we can like, you know, put this on top. We can put whatever we want to on top. And like, maybe we lose a health to it, but you know, we couldn't really do much with our hand anyways. This says go again, right? But no, this is a red card, right? It's not a blue. Usually when they make these cards and all the other Riptide specs, they're blues. This is a red, right? So you can't pitch it effectively, right? This card is just garbage, right? It's awful. Anytime you play this card, you are losing 3 value to the block, and then you're losing a life because your opponent attacks. Because using a trap to block this 0/1, this isn't a card. This isn't a card. Traps are good because they block 3. If you block this with a trap, you're blocking 0. You block 0. You block 0. I'm gonna lose my mind. Okay. There are some other interesting things about this card, though, right? Like, the only really interesting thing about this card to me is the fact that it says you can't play or activate cards you own, so you can't play defense reactions on your turn. There's a lot of decks that are trying to fatigue the opponent, right? Like the opposing Riptide. You are losing 3 value from your hand to do it. First of all, right? So let's just get that out of the way, right? We could have just dealt 3 more damage, and instead we're choosing not to. What does that mean? Well, it means your opponent better have more than 1 defense reaction in their hand, right? Because if they have less than 1 defense, if they have 1 defense reaction or less in their hand, you discarded a card, and your opponent's just going to arsenal the defense reaction, right? And now your 3 cards trade for their 3 cards, right? I don't know, maybe you're able to do it on a 6-card hand with New Horizons, who knows? But like, just on average, this card deals 0 damage, gives your opponent a weapon to swing at you for 1, and then means that they can't play defense reactions on that turn. So if they have multiple defense reactions in hand, they're punished. If they have just 1, they're not punished. Looking at the current existing meta, right? Gravy will never have a defense reaction in hand against Riptide. He's just going to run you over. Slippy, they might have 1 defense reaction in hand. They might, very rarely they'll have 2. But if they, you know, have more than 1, then they're just gonna play their cards anyways, or block with their cards, right? And then swing at the Trollistra, try and get a defense reaction out of their hand, arsenal the other one, you know. Like, maybe you catch your opponent with 3 defense reactions in hand, and then you play take the bait, search take the bait, play take the bait, search take the bait, play take the bait. I don't know, that's pretty trolling, but it's possible, right? If you ever get the read at the start of the turn, you're like, you have 3 defense reactions. Boom, take the bait, take the bait, take the bait. It's like, it's not like good, but it's something you can do. There's never been a deck in Flesh and Blood that's played so many defense reactions where you could reasonably consider the fact that they might have 3 in hand, except for like exactly Riptide. So anyways, I don't want to talk about this card anymore. This card makes me sad. Not that it was printed, like, it's a funny card, it's got good art. Just like seeing people thinking this card is like playable at all is just like, really, it makes me sad. Let's just talk about other cards though, because, you know, I actually don't think this card is very complicated to think about. Let's look at Spur Locked. I think this card is actually really interesting to think about. because these sorts of tutor to hand effects aren't very common in the game. I don't think they're particularly good, just because you see them with so many cards in Flesh and Blood, but this card is interesting to think about at least. So this card is a 0-cost 3-block blue. So it's already better than Take the Bait, right? But it says each hero secretly chooses a number between 1 and 6, and then those numbers are revealed. The hero that chooses the highest number loses that much life, searches their deck for a card with cost less than or equal to the chosen number, reveals it, puts it in their hand, then shuffle. And if I remember correctly, if you tie, nothing happens, right? So, this is a blue block 3. Fine, right? We play blue block 3s, and sometimes they don't do anything, right? This Chaos, it only goes in Slippy, whatever. This card can technically tutor for basically any card in your deck, right? That's pretty cool. It puts it directly into hand. We're already better than Take the Bait, right? So, we're happy for Slippy. Now, sometimes your opponent says, ooh, some cards in my deck are worth like 12, right? You know, like if your opponent is looking at their hand and they're Katsu, right? And you could give them an extra bond. They're like, oh yeah, I'm naming 6 every time. Slam 6, right? Maybe they're, you know, they're Slippy and they're looking at their hand. And they're like, ooh, if I had the extra Justinic here, my hand deals like 25 and takes 2 cards, right? And so they're like, oh yeah, I'm losing 6 life here every time. So they name 6 life. And then you have to think like, oh, okay, well, do I name 6 as well? And then if they don't name 6, I've used a card from my hand, lost 6 life, so that's 9 value to get a card. Are any of the cards in my deck worth more than 9? Not often, but you know, sometimes it's possible, right? This card does get more interesting when your opponent's at like 1 or 2 because they can't name anything higher, right? If they're at 2 life and you can just name 2 because they can't name 2 or else they're dead, right? But if you're at that low life total and you're up enough that you're able to just play this card out, well, you know, it's whatever. But the way you have to think about this card is that your opponent gets to bet with more life because you already spent 3 life to play this card, right? If your opponent is playing a deck that attacks, which is most decks in Flesh and Blood, by the way, you could have just blocked 3. But instead, you put down the big blind of 3 life. And now your opponent, they just get that 3 for free, right? So now you have to bet even more life on top of that 3 life in order to try and find a high value card. Which is why nobody plays Spur Locked, right? This card is garbage, right? It's probably the worst blue 3-block in the game, right? There's way more other 3-blocks that, you know, we'd rather put in our deck, right? I'd rather put a Bauble in my deck instead of this because I might accidentally play Spur Locked instead of just blocking with it. So now let's talk about some other cards that, you know, have interesting value propositions. Codex of Frailty. Everybody knows Codex of Frailty. Everybody knows Codex of Frailty is a good card, right? So Codex is a 2-block yellow 0-cost, pitches for 2. Each hero puts an action card from their graveyard face down into their arsenal. Each hero that does discards a card. Create a Ponder token under your control and a Frailty token under each opponent's control. Let's just discuss this as an Assassin because Assassin is more played than Ranger right now. So, what is said on the card is that you turn a card in. Both players turn a card from their hand into a card into their arsenal. Right, but you get the best card in your graveyard, right? So maybe you discard some blue that you don't care about and becomes a red, right? That seems pretty cool. And then you get a Ponder token. So this card replaces itself and replaces a card in your hand, and they're slightly better than what they were before, and your opponent gets a Frailty token. So, you know, if your opponent cares about the Frailty, sometimes, you know, if they're playing a deck that plays Kodachis, maybe, you know, the Frailty token's worth 3 value. Sometimes it's worth 0 value, right? So the Frailty token is worth anywhere from like 0 to 3, right? And if Codex is replacing itself and with the Ponder token and you're replacing card from your hand with a good card in your graveyard, well, maybe you could consider the card from hand to graveyard like maybe like 1 or 2 value. So maybe this is like a 0 for like somewhere between 0 for 1 and 0 for 5, right? That sounds good. Now, but the thing is that you're not replacing a card in your hand. You're actually just gaining a card. So now what does this card say? Well, the Codex of Frailty replaces itself with the Ponder token. So those cancel out. and you've now drawn your leave no witnesses, which is a 0 for 4. All right. So at base, this is a 0 for 4, right? With a ponder token worth 3, right? So this is a 0 for 7, right? And then you give your opponent the frailty. That's worth between 0 and 3, right? So it's 0 for 7 to 0 for 10. And then you force your opponent to have an arsenal into your leave no witnesses, which, how much value that actually is, it's hard to say, right? Sometimes, giving your opponent a good arsenal and then they block the leave no witnesses, right? It's kind of a crapshoot. But sometimes, your opponent can't block the leave no witness, and then they lose another full card, and then Codex of Frailty starts being worth 13, right? So this card by itself is just insane, right? But when you discuss the value of Codex of Frailty, the easiest way to do it is by separating all of the separate parts of the card, right? The put an attack action from their graveyard face down their arsenal. Each hero that does that discards a card, right? That's one part, right? And if you read that correctly, you realize that you don't have to discard a card if you have no cards in hand. And then create a ponder token under your control and a frailty under each opponent's control. And then you read that part, and you realize that a ponder token is another card, and a frailty is some ambiguous value. And then you treat value as a range, and then you decide how good the card is. Note that a good card is Scar for a Scar, right? Scar for a Scar sees a lot of play in a bunch of different decks. It's a 0 for 4, go again, right? And that's all it does. It's just a 0 for 4. So if your card is worth more than 4, it's probably good. If it's worth less than 4, it's probably not playable unless it has some very specific, thing in your deck. If we look at Take the Bait, right, that card does nothing. So you lost 3 value by playing it. So it's a 0 compared to 4, right? And then your opponent attacks you for 1. So it's actually a -1 card, for 0, right? As opposed to a 0 for 4, right? So you lost 5 value compared to the average card in your deck. You lost 5 value compared to a good card. If I just put Scar for a Scar in my deck instead of Take the Bait, I'd be up 5 value, right? Now, if I play Codex of Frailty instead of Take the Bait, well, I gained 10 value minimum off Codex of Frailty, right? And then I didn't get attacked for 1, right? So I'm up 11, right? I don't want to talk about Take the Bait anymore. Let's talk about Tipple, right? Tipple comes in 3 colors. Let's just talk about the red, right? Golden Tipple, red, 1 cost, 2 block, 3 attack. When this attacks, you may discard a yellow card. If you do, draw a card, create a gold token. So, right, there's a couple different effects, right? First of all, this attacks for 3, and it costs 1, right? So sometimes it's a 2-card 3. Usually you can use the other 2 resources, right? So 1 for 3 is not the greatest with Go Again. 1 for 4 ends up being okay. 1 for 5 is great, right? If every card in my deck was a 1 for 5 Go Again, I'd be feeling totally fine with my deck. Now, this has a couple other effects, right? I may discard a yellow card if I do draw a card and create a gold token. So, if I have a yellow card in my hand, I discard the yellow, and then I draw a card. So, the discard replaces itself, and I make a gold. Now, the cool thing about Tipple is that it costs 1, and so the 2 that you have floating, you can put into the cold immediately after, right? So, the one that you pitch replaces itself with another card. Right. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we kind of just played a 0 for 3, right? Which is good. It's fine. We start a hand with Tipple, yellow, blue. Blue for Tipple, discard. Get this card back. We have 2 floating. We have a gold token. And then the Tipple's on the stack. And then we have 2 cards. So we 0 for 3'd, which is fine, right? There's a lot of decks that just have to play 0 for 3 Go Agains, right? Now, Tipple's obviously better because sometimes you discard an ally. And when you discard an ally to Tipple, now you're insanely up. Because when you discard an ally, this discard no longer becomes a discard because the card in your grave is the same as the card in hand. So, we started with Tipple, ally blue. We pitch the blue for the Tipple. discard an ally, draw another card, and then we draw a card off the gold. And so we have these 2 cards in our hand and the ally, and then the Tipple attacked. So we drew an extra card off Tipple, right? That's why this card is broken. That's why we play 9 of them, right? Is because Golden Tipple red is just like a no card 3. We went card neutral and we dealt 3 damage. Or if we did the blue version, we went even on cards and we got a blue in our graveyard and dealt 1 damage. Not to mention all the synergy it has with Hook, right? Or any other sort of things. Or like sea legs, right? Or whichever, right? It's got a lot of synergy, right? That's why we play 9 of this in Gravy, is because it's a nothing for 3. It's not a 0 for 3. It's a nothing for 3. We didn't use a card to deal 3 damage, right? And that's why I think this card is kind of hard to wrap your head around when you first look at it, because it doesn't look like it really does anything. But then you realize, oh, if I discard an ally, I'm card neutral, right? I don't really know how to end this video. Like I just got so triggered by watching people react to this that I decided I needed to say something. I needed to say something. Like how are you gonna look at a 0 for 3 non-attack action, do literally nothing, give your opponent a damage against you? Like I don't know. I'm going crazy. I Yeah, I started making this at like 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Why? Why?